Organized money.
Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button so that more people can get exposed to organized money. Really appreciate it. So it's Luigi Mangione's birthday.
It's the birthday show.
Birthday show
episode.
of Luigi, who is in jail for allegedly assassinating the United Healthcare CEO. And he sent a letter. What happened with this letter?
we kind of got this news yesterday. So I guess his birthday was a week or so ago, and he put this letter out with the 27 things to be thankful for on his 27th birthday. And there was a bunch of stuff in it. And I scroll down to number 8, and he says, I'm thankful for independent media like the American Prospect, which is the magazine that I run. And, it's hard to know what to do with this information, like to say, hey, alleged murderer approved.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
The Luigi thing is so, I think, awkward because there was not a small number of people in this country who were cheering for him murdering an executive, which I think was really chilling. Also speaks to how much people hate UnitedHealth Group.
That's right. It was indicative of this latent anger about the healthcare system that we have that was just really thrown into sharp relief by that action. And, the major mainstream media was just horrified. How could you support someone who kills people? And
it is horrifying.
Other people were saying,
they're not wrong to say that.
They're not wrong to say that. But at the same time, how could you support UnitedHealthcare, which commits murder by spreadsheet, as you said, many.
Right. Like murder is always wrong, whether it's done whether it's done with a spreadsheet but I think what we want to get to in this show is that like the anger that people feel towards UnitedHealth Group, towards, these large corporations and private equity groups that are taking over medicine is actually prompting a more, a better response, like policy response at a state level. Largely, there's a little bit of federal stuff, but Oregon this week just passed a bill that would actually make it illegal for corporations, large corporations or private equity, or really anyone but a doctor to control a doctor's practice in the state. And it's a major deal, and it's directly targeted at UnitedHealth Group, which subsidiary Optum owns a bunch of stuff in the state.
Yeah, it's really amazing, and it could be a model for the entire nation. And we have two great people here to talk about it. Hayden Rooke-Ley, he in part works with you at the American Economic Liberties Project, but also he is at Brown University. And also we have the sponsor of the bill. His name is Ben Bowman. He's the majority leader of the House of Representatives in Oregon. And for years, he's been trying to get this bill passed, and he finally did this year. It was signed into law this week by the governor of Oregon. And it's really interesting, the process and how this thing came to pass, and what it actually does. It closes a loophole whereby these practices were able to take over and really direct what patient care looked like and what the practice of doctors looked like.
It also get rid of non-competes for clinicians, but the most important part of it is that it is terrifying the private equity industry and the corporate healthcare industry, because it actually is likely to spread to other states.
Yeah. Well, they know about viruses, and this is indeed likely to spread. So we're going to talk to Hayden and Ben, and it's going to be a great discussion. Check it out, Organized Money. All right, Hayden Rooke-Ley and Ben Bowman, Representative, House Majority Leader from Oregon. Thank you for both being here today. Appreciate it.
Really excited to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
You got it. So for some background, we should talk about the law as it was, because there has been this law on the books restricting the corporate practice of medicine, I believe since 1947 in Oregon. So could you tell me about the law as it was, and then we can talk about how it was sort of only in theory rather than in practice?
Hayden, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So Oregon, like many states and still most states in the country today, has long had what's known as this corporate practice of medicine ban. And in Oregon, this began in 1947, actually through common law, through judge-made law. This is a doctrine that comes out of the common law tradition. But states, including Oregon, over time have codified this in statute. And really what it amounts to is that the state requires that for-profit medical practices are owned either by a majority or exclusively, depending on the state, by licensed physicians and other clinicians in the state. This arises out of this long tradition of being concerned that non-clinicians, that lay entities, lay corporate entities, or lay individuals will take control of medical practices and medical decision-making and have interest towards profit making rather than putting the interests of their patients first. And this ownership.
Why would anybody be concerned about that? That seems like it would never happen. Sorry, go on. There's going to be a lot of sarcasm in this.
Yeah. So the one point, and this actually speaks to your point, Matt, about ownership and governance here is important. So it's not just that we're concerned about lay entities, corporate entities controlling physicians. You could have laws that prohibit the corporate entity from basically meddling in differential diagnostic decisions, but still employing the physicians. What corporate practice of medicine bans say is that they take a broader understanding of what it means to control the medical practice. And they actually say that there's a whole host of decisions that are made in the medical practice by the people who actually control the medical practice, whether it's how long clinicians have to spend with their patients, or whether it has to do with how coding and billing and diagnostic decisions are made, or practices around scheduling, that all these decisions in terms of the management control of the practice implicate how physicians deliver care and how patients receive them. So this is a more capacious, a broader understanding of what it means to control clinical decision-making. And this is what inspires these rules across the United States, requiring that for-profit medical practices are actually owned by clinicians who are licensed in the state.
You know, that's a really interesting thing to hear. And it kind of cuts against this notion that America's always been this laissez-faire paradise. Because if it came out of common law, then that means it goes back like a really long time. And the kind of the idea of the business of medicine is a relatively new concept. I mean, not totally, but like the ideas of corporatizing medicine or these sort of shareholder returns in medicine is new. I remember when I was a kid, you know, when I go to the pediatrician, and it was I hated going to the pediatrician. Every kid hates it because they get shots and stuff. It was like they own their own practice. It wasn't a question, right? Like there was just that you found your pediatrician and you had your pediatrician your whole childhood, and they owned their own practice, and there was, you know, some assistants or whatever that worked there.
Dr. Bittman, represent. That was my guy.
Yeah, and
got me through.
It's funny because we have this, like, it's kind of a big part of your childhood memory. It's like you're a pediatrician. And, you know, today, I mean, I go to the doctor and it's all, you know, it's group practices. And I like cycled through like 4 or 5 doctors in the last 10 years because they just keep quitting. But my daughter, you know, she's not going to have the experience of having one pediatrician. Like she's already seen multiple pediatricians in one of these group practices. So kind of what happened? Like why?
Yeah, so we've always regulated the medical industry in different ways. I think a helpful way of thinking about the rise of corporate medicine and corporate ownership and corporate employment of physicians really starts around the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. And that's when we made the decision, a quite deliberate decision, actually, to really outsource the regulation of our healthcare system to large corporate entities who were going to rationalize the system and bring efficiencies to the system. This was quite deliberate in many ways, and it started with health management organizations, and you could see it track through the move towards managed care and to Medicare Advantage and the rise of UnitedHealth and its vertically integrated entities, and even through what we're seeing now since really the Affordable Care Act, the rise of value-based payment, value-based care, accountable care organizations. And I think from a regulatory perspective, what this is a delegation of that regulatory function to these large vertically integrated entities. And the whole idea was that they were going to control physicians and patients and rationalize this system. It's a particular decision of how we want to regulate the system, and it very much departs from other conceptions of how we might organize markets in the healthcare system. And importantly, it necessitates that we get rid of corporate practice of medicine bans, because again, the whole conception here is that we're going to have larger corporate entities controlling and managing physicians. Therefore, we want them to control them. So it's not a coincidence that we started to see the erosion of CPOM really with the rise of health management organizations.
Yeah, that's really interesting, this idea of sort of outsourcing the regulation. Because you brought up a couple things there that we might want to elaborate on. People might not know exactly what they are, like value-based care. That was this idea that the real problem in healthcare with the costs were spiraling out of control, and what we need is to create a system so that uh, it's rationing by another name, I think is what they were looking for. This idea that if you provide the right incentives, that the companies themselves will bend the cost curve, reduce the cost of patient care, and allegedly do it in a way that wouldn't affect patients at all.
That's right. Again, I think this is a move away from traditional tools that I think we can actually associate with the tradition of regulated industries across telecommunications, banking, mail delivery, electrification, where we had tools like rate regulation that we've seen in the healthcare system as well. The turn away from that towards this managed care paradigm, as I've called it, which includes outsourcing to insurance companies and accountable care organizations and value-based payment. This is a move away from direct regulation, particularly direct price regulation, and having these vertically integrated entities take on the cost management function. The whole purpose of value-based payment is that providers are going to assume the insurance function. And this is where you see the parallels to the original health maintenance organizations. The whole idea there was that the health maintenance organization was going to collapse the distinction between the provider and the insurance company. With the rise of value-based payment, that's really accelerated since the ACA was really adopted as a policy framework by the Democrats, taken from a more conservative conception of how we want to regulate the system. Again, the idea is that we're going to collapse this function. We're going to outsource to the provider entity, have them take on the insurance function, and therefore get to efficiency rationalization in a different way, rather than, again, wielding public authority directly and just doing that through the Medicare program, through the Medicaid program, and increasingly, as we're seeing at the state level, do that in the commercial insurance market.
So I find this really interesting. I could talk to you all day, and I have. But I think actually there's a really powerful political story here that we want to get into, because this law is groundbreaking, and we're fortunate, that Representative Bowman, I'm going to call you Ben, because I think even though I pretend I'm being respectful and saying Representative Bowman. But you really were like the engine behind what I think is a groundbreaking law. But how did you get interested in this problem?
So I wanna pick up on where Hayden left off in answering David's question. So to put it really clearly, Oregon has a law on the books already that says medical clinics have to be owned by doctors. That's the law.
Right.
Majority stake has to be owned by doctors. And at the same time, over the last 10 years, across the country, we've seen an explosion of private dollars and large corporations purchasing up medical clinics, including in my state. So, how do you square this law that says doctors have to own these clinics with this rapid rise in takeovers of the medical clinics? And the answer is essentially there are loopholes. There are workarounds that corporate attorneys have figured out so that on paper, they are in compliance with the law that requires physician ownership, but they employ what we call straw doctors or friendly physicians or captive physicians, where there's a doctor who technically owns the clinic on paper, but they've never been to the clinic. They don't work at the clinic. Some of them have never even been to Oregon, but they're the owner of these Oregon clinics. And it's a complete, it's the opposite of what the intent of the corporate practice of medicine law was.
So,
Um,
so it's like a rent-a-doctor.
yeah,
You
exactly.
just need to rent someone to be the head of the place.
And for some of these corporations who employ this model, they've got one doctor who owns all these clinics in a web across the country, who
Yeah.
checks the box for them. We have a doctor owner, but the
That
doctor's
guy
never.
must be rich. He owns all these facilities.
I'm certain that he is. So that's essentially the problem.
He also must be really busy because he's making
But
all these decisions for all these practices.
so one thing I had trouble understanding the specific ownership structure. So you've got like a clinic, right?
Mhm,
And the straw doctor owns that clinic, and then
mhm.
you have like the management services organization that is kind of like runs the clinic. Is that a separate company, and is all the profits moved to the management service? Is that the like loophole that they use, or how does it? How do the dividends get to the rich private equity guy or to United, like to Optum? Like how do they pull money out of it? If it's owned by, if the clinic itself is owned by a straw doctor, is the real money maker owned by someone else or what?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, so the MSO with Management Service Organization is a subsidiary of, in the case of Optum, UnitedHealth. So the straw doctor has signed an MSA, a management services agreement, that essentially cedes control, power
Okay.
over to the subsidiary of
There you
Optum.
go.
Got it. This is a lot. You see this in lots of areas in the economy. Like you see it. I think I saw it with casinos, which are like they're rented out to like REITs, but really the REIT is owning them. And you saw it with like structured credit. You see it like, I mean, it's kind of like fraud-ish. Like not like fraud is illegal, but like fraudishness is kind of fun.
Truthiness,
Yeah.
fraudishness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my understanding is, and Ben, you can tell us how specifically, but one of these events that triggered a real rethinking in Oregon was about this entity called Oregon Medical Group,
Yes.
and which was, I guess, in 2020 was purchased by Optum. Could you tell us that story and whether or not that really sort of clarified what the real problem was here?
Totally. This is an incredibly important moment. So, like, the backdrop is we ran this bill in the short session. And in Oregon, we have a 6 week short session, really abbreviated legislative timelines. We get the bill out of the House, we get the bill out of the Senate committee, and then it dies the day before adjournment because of some sort of procedural delay tactics. And it's
Mhm.
incredibly frustrating.
And so that was in 2023 or 2024
That
that
was
you
in
first.
2024.
Okay.
Um, right after the short session, there's this massive story in Oregon about what happened at the Oregon Medical Group. So, Oregon Medical Group was a physician-owned practice down in Eugene, and they sold to Optum. The promise at the time, as told by the doctors, is Optum said, "We're not going to change anything. We're just
Mhm.
coming in to help you with the management services. You all want to focus on patients. We're going to help you do that. Nothing's going to change. Don't worry about it." Well, over the course of the next few years, things did indeed change. The doctors were told to take on more work. Staffing models changed. And the byproduct of that was dozens of physicians left the clinic. Over 32 doctors left the clinic in a span of about 3 years. Well, in a
Mhm.
market like Eugene, what that actually means is over 10,000 patients lost their primary care doctor. And in some cases, the docs had signed a non-compete agreement, which meant they were out. They were done. They were not seeing any patients. So this exploded onto the local news. You have there's news stories where these like elderly people are on the news being holding up this letter they got from Optum saying, we don't have a primary care doctor anymore. And all of a sudden, our short session bill, which was largely theoretical for a lot of people, became really tangible for
Mm.
the cities in our state.
Mhm.
You know, that was really striking to me. I was watching some of the testimony because about on this, and what was so interesting is that there were two members of the state house who got screwed by Optum, both of whom had cancer, and I was like, wow. I like kind of want to give a slow clap to United Health Group. I'm like, wow, that is some impressive lobbying against your own interests to like, I don't know. I mean, so what were the impacts? Like what were, so people lost their doctors, like what were some of the other impacts that you were seeing? Did you get contacted by it by your own constituents? Like how did the like I noticed there what didn't seem to be much opposition to this legislation. Like what were the impacts and then how did that like change the politics?
Yeah, so after we ran this bill in the short session, we became like a collection point for doctors and patients across the state to like send their stories
Hmm.
of how ownership models had obstructed their ability to practice, how non-compete agreements had sidelined them so that they couldn't see patients anymore. We had doctors who were fearful, who would only speak anonymously to us because they thought that they were going to get fired
Hmm.
or sued by a large corporation. So
Which they would have,
Yeah,
which is
so,
they were right.
they were correct.
to your point, I think this is a really interesting point. To your point about what was the opposition like, if you look online, if you look on Oregon Legislative Information System, this is where all the public comment gets collected. It's overwhelmingly supportive. You would look at that and you'd be like, "Oh, this must have just been an inevitability." The reality is there was a ton of people trying to kill this bill. Largely paid lobbyists in the building, most of whom did not submit testimony in
Oh, interesting.
either verbally or in writing, because guess
Right.
what? When those names of those big corporations and private equity firms are listed as the opponents, that's actually pretty helpful for our side, who's
Yeah.
trying to regulate those entities, because most
Right.
sponsors
Right.
do not want them in charge of
I,
healthcare.
I
So
I saw one letter and it was listed as One Medical, but you'd have to know something about healthcare to know that that's Amazon. Amazon purchased One Medical a little while back, so that was interesting to me that Amazon was a major
I
opponent of this bill.
I saw one of the testimony was from the Chamber of Progress, which I encounter in like other parts of my life, like dealing with Google, and they have nothing to do with healthcare. And they like just take money and do whatever, but they're like focused on big tech. So this was just like, I don't know, they were freelancing for more. The checkbook
Hey,
must have
just
been
in
open.
case, you never
Yeah.
know.
I mean,
well, I think
it
it's
was
because the
Maybe they're good.
members, like there are some trade associations where you'd look at the trade associations, the name of the trade association, you'd be like, what is their involvement here? But it turns out one of the biggest members of the trade association was Amazon,
yeah.
or were these private equity owned groups. The other tactic
Right.
you'll see is like you'll see some doctors who were opposed. Well, the doctors are in some cases the straw doctor, or in other cases
Hmm.
they have a different sort of financial arrangement with a private equity firm where they're sort of financially benefiting from the current arrangement, which, in my opinion, is an undermining of the corporate practice of medicine
But
law.
the larger experience of doctors, I think, and Hayden, you might be able to answer this, has really shifted a lot. I think when people think of the American Medical Association, they think about their
Hmm.
opposition in the 40s to Medicare. And about a year ago, they came out in favor of state-based corporate practice medicine laws. And it just feels like, and I've talked to a lot of doctors, ER physicians and things like that, saying this corporate control has really impacted my ability to do the job that I trained my whole career for. And so do you see that the medical community itself has become really a powerful force in this, and they've really turned around from where they were previously?
I think it remains to be seen. I think
Okay.
right
Maybe I'm
now,
I'm too happy about that. I'm too
yeah, we'll
positive.
see. I mean, I think there's certainly when rank and file physicians get involved in policy, they can have an immense impact. They still have the trust of their patients, generally, of I think the wider public. There's a real question right now of what direction physicians as a community are going to take. Like levels of burnout, of professional demoralization, of moral injury are just staggeringly high. And
Mhm.
as you referenced, we're no longer in the days where physicians are the most dominant entity politically, socially, certainly politically, economically in the healthcare system. We have much larger industries that predominate. And part of the turn I referenced earlier, part of the change towards this, managed care paradigm or outsourcing of regulation, whatever we want to call it, or just empowering of large corporate entities to control our healthcare system, was in response to a concern that the state had protected physicians too much, had basically granted them a
Mm.
monopoly. And we were in a system back then that looked much different. We didn't have price regulation, for example. Doctors just billed whatever. So it actually really mattered if the state was going to come in and basically allow them to constrict supply, to have licensing laws, to make them the only owners of physician practices. In response to that, what we said is let's just let it rip. Let's let anybody come in. Let's get rid of these corporate practice of medicine laws functionally, and that's what we've done. And I think what folks are starting to realize as the Wall Street, private equity, large hospital conglomerates take control, we may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And you see very clearly, again, the demoralization of physicians as they become wage laborers. Like that's clearly what's happening. We in the outpatient setting with physician practices, this happens through the management services organization. The hospital, with certain hospitals, it just happens through direct employment. And so I think there's a real question of how the physician community is going to respond here. And we're at a real moment where we're starting to see physician unionization. We're starting to see laws like corporate practice of medicine laws that might restore ownership of their practices. And I think, it could go in a number of different directions.
So I want to get into that, and I want to ask the question in a slightly different way, which is about whether there's a generational split. But I want to ask about doctors, but also politicians. First, I want to go with doctors because I think that's really interesting, and we're already talking about it. And I'm told that humans like to have continuity with conversation, so I'll go there first. So I've talked to doctors about private equity, and when I go to the doctor or whatever, and most of them are just like don't have necessarily a view one way or the other, but some of them are like, oh yeah, it's cool. We got this new machine because we got like, or they don't say it, but you can kind of tell I like money. And then some of them are, they just like hate it. And not just doctors, but like medical providers, like all sorts of, there's all sorts of medical providers and therapists and whatever. And some of them really hate this kind of corporate intrusion, and some of them don't. To what extent is it generational, right? Like the older ones who are kind of have something to sell, and maybe don't have student debt or whatever, are fine and they like it, and the younger ones are not? Or is that like, am I overreading it?
Yeah, I actually think it cuts in both directions here. And this is what part of my uncertainty about where the medical community is going to go. Like on the one hand, I talk to a lot of older physicians who will say, who are really dedicated to their profession, their craft, and the moral purpose behind it. Like it's more than just a job. And they see that these corporate entities are taking over, and it really gives them a sense of disappointment. But you also have a lot of older physicians who want to sell their practice, and you hear these stories of them, selling out to get a great paycheck and leaving the physicians who are there to basically be employed. And then with the younger physicians, you hear both from them and from their or from older physicians. I kind of hear two different strands as well. One, some of the older physicians will say a lot of the younger physicians are just resigned to the system at this point. It's just a job. And the system has become so corporatized that they just clock in and clock out, and there's not a deeper meaning there. I tend to not believe that. I think anybody who gets into medicine has a significant part of them they do for the fundamental service component of medicine. So you hear those stories about a sense of resignation almost, given the world that younger doctors grow up in. But in many ways, you have a workforce that looks different now than it did 30 or 40 years ago of physicians. And I think a lot of younger physicians who are, again, dedicated to the service element of the profession, and who see once they get out of training, oftentimes in nonprofits, community health centers, and they get to a private practice or a hospital, and they realize that, the suits are making all the decisions here. And then it gets to this question of like, well, what do we do? And that's where you're seeing various shoots of reform.
Well, I think maybe we'll bring Ben back in here. And could you just sort of describe what this bill actually does? What is the mechanism by which you close these loopholes around straw doctors or other strategies? Just tell me what the bill does.
So a couple things. The easiest to understand is we severely limit the use of non-compete agreements, non-disparagement clauses, stock transfer restriction agreements. There's this whole host of contractual clauses that are used to control doctors that we essentially put to the side. Um, the very the,
And let me just
yeah, go ahead,
can I
Hayden.
just jump in on that point too, because I think Ben's hitting on one of kind of two main parts of the bill. And these restrictions are ways in which, to go back to the earlier point in the conversation, ways in which the management services organization through contracting becomes the de facto owner of the practice. So the MSO, when we talk about a corporate entity buying a practice, what we're really talking about is a management services organization controlling the practice. The professional corporation, the PC, the entity that actually has to that remains as a separate corporate entity. And what the MSO will do, be it private equity, they'll go to a practice and they'll buy out the shares of the PC and then essentially dissolve them and install this friendly or captive physician who is functionally one of their employees as an MSO. And then that's where the MSA that Ben was explaining comes in, where they might bind them to non-compete agreements and non-disparagement agreements. Stock transfer restriction agreements are basically ways through contract for a separate entity to control what equity shareholders can do with their shares. So the MSO, if you bind a physician to a stock transfer restriction agreement, you then contractually have control over the decisions that are made by the physician with his or her equity. And then, so those are two of the kind of per se restrictions. The other is to prohibit the ownership of the professional corporation that has to be majority clinicians, prohibit the majority of those clinicians from being employees of the management services organization. Because again, the most extreme version of this model is that the MSO just takes a physician on their payroll and just installs them. Right. And again, then just subordinates the practice to the MSO.
Is this across all practices, or is this restricted to certain clinics, or is this any kind of health practice in Oregon is going to have these new rules against it?
Yeah, all medical clinics. Oregon's corporate practice of medicine law excluded hospitals starting back in the 1970s, I think. So they and a few other designations are sort of regulated separately. There's some ongoing conversation about Oregon about what it might look like to apply this kind of regulatory framework on hospitals and some other settings. But that's probably the next.
But you got your foot in the door with what
For sure.
what you're doing.
The other part of the bill that I think is important to note, think about why a corporation or a private equity firm would want to buy a clinic. What are the decisions that they can make that can turn up the profit and can bring money in? They can section. They can change staffing models. They can shorten appointment times from 20 minutes to 10 minutes. And importantly, they can say, we're not making very much money from Medicaid reimbursement, so we're going to slowly decline the percentage of our patients who are on Medicaid. Our bill basically takes all decision making in a clinic that impacts patient care and says these are decisions for doctors, not for corporations. We don't allow the MSO to cross that line into decision making that will impact patients.
So let me be the devil's advocate here, and I really do mean the devil. No, I am just kidding. No, not really. So okay, I might say if I were a straw doctor, I might say, what are you talking about? The way we're going to make money is we're going to get supplies cheaper because we have more bargaining power and we can do that.
Great.
And also we have a lower cost of capital because we're owned by whatever. And so we can borrow money cheaper. And I don't know. I mean, we also, yeah, sure, Medicaid has like certain rates, but we can bargain better with like commercial payers. So we'll get better rates. None of this has to do with like cutting. I mean, obviously we know that none of this has to do with cutting quality, or it doesn't inherently have to do with cutting quality.
So importantly, this bill does not ban private equity investment. It doesn't ban corporate investment. It doesn't ban partnerships with lay people who are non-physicians. What it says is, if you want to be part of a larger conglomerate, you want to be part of that, using scale to absolutely go for it. As long as your business model doesn't depend on you dictating to doctors decisions that impact patient care, we will permit those partnerships under this law.
So the kind of good ways to do profit, which I think actually those are not good things. We need to fix that so that you can actually get money on equal terms. You can get supplies on equal terms. But like, that's kind of where I was going actually with it, which is like, there are these other problems that are leading to consolidation. And I'm kind of wondering, how do we fix those? Is that on, and not to be like, good job, now get to work, because that's not the point. Like, it's a groundbreaking bill. There are other things here, which we see in other industries. Like, they're not like, price discrimination is routine across the economy. So are cost of capital differentials, and bargaining power buyers and stuff like that. So are those some of the things you're going to look at to make sure that this industry, like that these clinics can actually survive and flourish as physician owned or medical practitioner owned?
100%. I mean, it was one side of this is like you have to prevent the bad things from happening when the bad things are happening so quickly. But the other side of it is you need to go upstream and you need to make it a little bit easier for physicians to go into independent practice. So we have a bill in the legislature right now that does a few things to make it a little bit easier for physician practices, everything from like loan forgiveness to
Mm.
like I don't believe that MSOs, management service organizations, are inherently bad. The idea of having an entity to support a clinic in doing the administrative functions, I think is great because it frees up time for doctors to see patients. What I care about is whether the decisions being made are being made by licensed providers or being made by people who have a fiduciary duty to maximize profit for their shareholders. That's the bright line we're drawing in the bill. It doesn't solve all the problems in our healthcare system, not by a long shot, but I think it's a good starting point. Hayden, what would you say?
Yeah, I would echo all those points. One, just on the MSO in trying to ensure that the types of services that are provided to practices are services that the physician practices actually want and that help them administratively run their practice. And I think there are a number of things, Ben, that you mentioned that could be done from a regulatory perspective that might make it a little bit easier for independent physician practices to sustain themselves. I think the larger point that Matt you're getting at is a bigger policy discussion about, again, how we've organized markets in our healthcare system and how we've essentially encouraged a type of competition, a type of market shaping that really above all else rewards size. If you're one of these small practices, you're getting 50% of Medicare from commercial insurers because you just don't have negotiating leverage. And your supplies, as you mentioned, cost much more. Whereas the hospital, if you join the hospital or if you join Optum, all of a sudden your fee schedule goes to 150, 200, 300%. That's a policy decision. That's a decision about how we structure markets. And again, it's one that connects up to other regulatory traditions where we might have been concerned about smaller entities being able to survive. If it's the case that we want small entities, small physician practices versus big ones to be able to survive, we can't have a system in which you as a smaller practice, which based on the literature provide as good, often better care, get a third of the rate to deliver that care. And that gets to questions of payment policy of healthcare financing that we're starting to see some states move on, trying to standardize prices across different payers to make it so you don't just get inherently penalized if you're small or if you see certain types of patients like Medicaid patients. This is this broader question of how we're governing our healthcare system and how we want to do payment policy.
So you're talking about states, starting to look at those types of strategies. I want to talk about how what was done in Oregon could then move on into other states. I read a story, Ben, about you had an Optum lobbyist that was talking to you about this bill and kind of openly said, like, you guys can't pass this bill because then other states might pass it, like something of that nature, right?
Yeah.
And my question is, do you think that lobbyist was right that this could be a national model?
So to clarify, it was not Optum's lobbyist who
Oh,
said
okay.
but it's actually even worse than that. It was a lobbyist who was hired by a business that did not operate in the state of Oregon. They had no practice in the state of Oregon, and they hired a lobbyist in Oregon. And the lobbyist told me this to my face in my office with my staff there, said, I've been hired to kill this bill because they don't want it to be something that other states start looking at.
Oh,
So
that is fascinating.
it was
Wow.
a wild moment.
Were you like, that seems not persuasive to me?
It did feel a bit like a gift. I've gotten some mileage out of telling that story. I mean, I think the reality is like every state is going to, I mean, the country is being confronted with this problem. Like the corporatization of our healthcare system is accelerating rapidly, and the outcomes are self-evident. Like outcomes for patients are getting worse, costs are going up, and physicians are leaving the field. That is what's happening. Those are direct byproducts of the rapid corporatization of our system. So we have offered in Oregon a step a initial solution. We've got a lot more work to do, but every state is going to be grappling with this because their healthcare is going to continue to cost more money, which is going to drain state dollars. They're going to continue to have physician shortages, and their patients are going to get worse care and are going to complain to their politicians about it. So I don't think it's like every state is going to be legislating in this area over the next decade plus. And I hope that they go in the direction that we've gone in. I think there's an urgent need to do so.
So, what do you think is going to happen to the healthcare system in Oregon? Like, it's a 3 year, it doesn't kick in for 3 years, so there's time.
Mhm.
Um, how are the corporate medical providers responding? Are are they going to sell, like, what are they going to sell their practices? Who's going to buy them? Like, are they going to do this is sort of an annoying term, but like a capital strike where they just intentionally sabotage the state and cause harm and then say, hey, you have to like repeal this bill. Like, what do you think is going to happen in the next couple of years? How will this play out?
It's a great question. We have been thinking and talking about this a lot over the last couple years, trying to think how they'd respond. I My thing is if they start to pull out and they start to sell all their clinics, like what our bill essentially says, aside from the contractual clauses and non-compete agreements, it really just says you can be in this state, you just can't override the decision making of doctors. So if they're going to pull their dollars out, it's an admission that their business model requires them to control physicians.
Mhm.
Right.
So if that's what their decision is, what Oregon is saying is we don't want your money. We care more
Yeah.
about our patients than your bottom line. So
Mhm.
whether or not they will pull out remains to be seen. Um, my best guess is they will figure it out. They will figure it out, and they will undergo the first few years and see how this impacts their bottom line. Um, like an important thing to remember about this bill, it doesn't ensure that the right decision gets made every time. It just makes sure doctors are the ones making it.
Right.
So like, it's not a
If
perfect.
I'm going to be screwed in the healthcare system, I want it to be by my
By
doctor.
a doctor.
That's
Being
exactly
cheated and
right.
scammed is a decision that should take place between the patient and the doctor. I don't want some middleman in there doing it to me.
Hayden, what do you think's going to happen?
I'd give the similar range of options. I think there's a possibility that these corporations, comply and figure out how to again just provide services through an MSO that doesn't necessitate actually controlling the practice. I think it's possible. We're watching closely what's going on in Arkansas right now with the structural separation bill between PBMs and
Let's
pharmacies.
talk about that. What happened in Arkansas, and how does that relate to what's happening here?
And just for context, this bill in Oregon is part of a wave of reform of state bills. This Arkansas one is probably the most aggressive, though it deals with, it's as aggressive as this Oregon one, but it deals with a different part of the system.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I've referenced this a few times. I think what we're starting to see at the state level is seeds of a different way of thinking about governing our healthcare system. And in response to corporate consolidation, the financialization, the change in sort of the character and nature of how entities are engaging in healthcare, we're seeing a big a response to. And it's a market shift from the evolution starting in the 80s that we described earlier, and frankly, from where federal policy is making has been. So you're seeing states respond in a bunch of different ways that are familiar. Again, if we look at sort of across industries, so we're seeing Indiana just this legislative session, as well as Vermont, pursue rate caps in the commercial market,
Mm.
really directly addressing.
For
Frankly,
hospitals.
Indiana is going to be the state, yeah, of hospitals, going to be have the state with the arguably the most aggressive price controls. Dead red Indiana. We're seeing in states across the country enact basically entry and exit restrictions, which has a long tradition in regulated industries in the U.S. Basically saying we want to decide whether this entity sort of managing capacity, managing supply, because in healthcare, in some areas we have way too little, in other areas we actually have too much capacity, and it leads to too much spending. And then we see a lot of states are insourcing their Medicaid drug benefits. They're no longer delegating them to insurance companies and their PBMs, understanding that they're just wasting money going through middlemen. We're seeing what happened in Oregon with CPOM and rules around ownership and governance, being really concerned about who actually owns medical entities. And then Arkansas is part of this tradition of greater antitrust and market shaping mechanisms, specifically structural separations. So what Arkansas has done is they've said, we're concerned about conflicts of interest. We're actually concerned about this model of fostering large vertically integrated conglomerates. We're skeptical that this is actually going to drive efficiency and drive better care. We're worried about what you would always might be worried about in this model, which is that these vertically integrated entities that own insurers, that own PBMs, that also own physician practices and also own pharmacies are going to exploit conflicts of interest to self-preference themselves. In the specific context in Arkansas, we're talking about PBMs, which control oftentimes where and how much pharmacists get paid and where drugs get picked up. The three largest PBMs in the country that dominate most of the market all have massive pharmacy businesses. And you might imagine that if you're an independent pharmacist, you might not get the same sort of treatment when you're dealing with that PBM as the pharmacy that's part of the PBM business gets treated. So what, out of concerns about fair competition and the ability of small pharmacies to be viable in the state and to compete on fair grounds, Arkansas said, if you're going to be the PBM, you can't also be the pharmacy, because structurally we're worried that you're going to compete, you're going to self-preference yourself, and you're going to drive small pharmacies out of business. So what Arkansas has said is you got to pick one. You can't be both. So they passed this law, again, structurally separating PBMs from pharmacies and making those entities decide whether they want to stay in the PBM business or stay in the pharmacy business.
And CVS has sort of responded to that, right? And they
yeah, CVS has chosen the PBM business, and they have said that, I believe they've said that they're going to pull their pharmacies in the state, again, opting to operate as a PBM. And they're also, I think they've sued recently and are trying to, in various ways, fight the bill.
And what's interesting is the state hasn't seemed to be fazed by the fact that they're wanting to leave. And so you have blue Oregon and red Arkansas both undertaking these attempts to, reformat or reform and change the way the healthcare system works. And I know that, I mean, what's interesting is this bill was bipartisan, right? There was this Republican named Cyrus Javadi, who I guess is a dentist, who was very supportive of the bill. And I'm just curious, Ben, like when you talk to your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I mean, obviously having someone who was a Republican who's very supportive helped, I'm sure. But how did they see the issue, and how did you relate to them on it?
Yeah, it's a good question. The easiest way to relate to the issue directly to many of my Republican colleagues who represent rural districts is, what do you think the first clinics to close when private equity takes over a group of clinics is? It's the
Right.
rural clinics who have a high Medicaid patient rate. Like they're making less money, so they close them down.
Yep.
And Rep. Javity, who did like genuinely incredible work on this bill and helped make it as bipartisan as it was, he could articulate what happened in his community with a dialysis clinic, where
Mm.
on 30 days' notice, a dialysis clinic got shut down, which was owned by some PE firm at the national level that was making, billions of dollars a year. They shut down the dialysis clinic that was serving people in his district. And like there was quotes in the newspaper about this woman who was like, some of us have decided we're just gonna let ourselves die because the alternative was to drive like 2 hours
Mm.
to Portland and back or whatever it was. So they all have like people understand what's happening to the healthcare system in their own district, and they like there are some people who voted against the bill for various reasons, but like I don't think there's many Republicans who think that private equity firms care about their constituents' healthcare. Like I think there's an emerging consensus that corporate control of healthcare, at least in Oregon, is a negative thing. Like
Yeah.
the debate on the Senate floor was pretty bipartisan in agreeing that that is bad. There's questions about how to regulate it, but I think that's encouraging.
So, one of the things that I'm old now, or I've become old. It's a thing that happens. And I've seen like a fair amount of politics,
Mhm.
and there's it, Ben, you seem different than the politicians that I was sort of seeing when I was younger. And you're a younger politician. And I guess I wonder, is there like a generational split among politicians? Are younger politicians in general more willing to come in and say, yeah, this system is not doing great. Let's play around with it. Let's try different things. Or was there really, am I just reading too much into it? And this kind of like, this kind of gets to a debate that's happening within the Democratic Party, which is controlled by like 90-year-olds at a federal level. It definitely feels like there's a different vibe here at states that are passing all of these laws and trying things versus the federal level, which is much more like constipated and kind of seems older and more like frail.
That's an interesting question. I mean, my answer on like the age of legislators is probably pretty unsatisfying. Like one of my like greatest supporters and one of the most helpful
Mm,
people in getting this passed was our former governor, John Kitzhaber, who is in his 70s.
yeah. I saw
And
his testimony. It was really impressive.
yeah,
Um,
he's incredibly
And he was
compelling.
a former doctor too, right?
Yep, former ER doctor
Yeah.
and the architect of Oregon's healthcare reform over the last, 30, 40 years.
Right.
So like I don't think it's age. I do think there's definitely something to the state federal dynamic. Like again, the states have no choice but to confront what is happening to our constituents. And so I think there's a little bit more I mean, we have much more functional systems in Congress, obviously, but I think there's also a higher risk tolerance of like we have to do something. We are going to pass this bill because the negative outcomes are unsustainable.
Well, it's a really great achievement. Congratulations on getting this passed and signed into law. Ben Bowman is the House Majority Leader in the Oregon Legislature. Hayden Rooke-Ley with the American Economic Liberties Project, who I'm sure is going to be trying to move this on to other states across the country and see what we can do. But thank you guys for both being on Organized Money.
Thanks for having us on. This was fun.
Appreciate you guys.
So that was great. And it's interesting what we got into at the end, like the split between states and the federal government and how states like don't have a choice but to actually fix things for their constituents, whereas the federal government can kind of mire itself in gridlock. And how, it does.
I was a little unsatisfied with that answer because, for a long time, states had been fucking things up too, right? And that like they don't have to fix things. There are plenty of states that don't, and so
I mean, that's
I
not
don't.
untrue, but I think what's different though is that healthcare has become sort of, I want to say unpolarized, that there's this consensus that when we're talking about somebody's healthcare, that at least at this level, at least at the state level, that Democrats and Republicans are both pissed off about the system that they ended up creating over these decades. And they want to do something about it. It might be different things, but they want to do something about it.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think even at the federal level, you're seeing it. But the point is that maybe it's not generational, maybe it's intellectual generational level or something. Something is different than it used to be, right? Like when we were arguing about the ACA, or about like fights in the '90s, it was always about access, right? It was always about like how can we get more people to have health insurance, and
Access
this.
and the cost curve. And, like, stopping healthcare from eating the budget and things like
Yeah,
that.
it's true. I will just say like the main debate was about single payer or like just
Sure.
the
It was
moral
about the
framework single
insurance
payer,
system.
but it's universalizing the system, right? And this is not actually a bill about universalizing the system at all. Like this isn't about we need more people to get access to health insurance. This is just a bill and about the delivery of care itself. And a lot of the bills that we were talking about are bills about the delivery of care. So it's like a different way of looking at like actually markets and healthcare
Right.
and
And
politics itself.
that's actually really interesting because what I remember always hearing from the healthcare wonks of the world is that, oh, well, the insurance companies are the easy villain, but the real problem is in the doctor's office. Now, the way they put it is that people were giving too much care or something. But the real
Right.
problem is actually in the C-suite that is directing the doctor's office. And that's what we're getting at now.
Right. I remember Atul Gawande's article in the New Yorker in like,
Right.
I don't know, 2007 or 8 or
Like
something,
the
where he
most
said,
expensive thing in a doctor's office is the pen,
right, which
that
is the
that kind
idea is like stuff is really expensive because the doctor just like wants to prescribe medicine. And so you have to limit that. And that is actually what Obamacare was about. And thank you, Ezra. And
of
uh,
thing.
and then like it was also, it was framed in this argument like we will give more access. So we're going to have, we'll universalize the system. Look, the number of uninsured people is declining, but then at the same time, like the 85, 90% of people who already have insurance, their care is going to get worse. Right. And I think that might be an explanation for why some of the politics have changed because, you might want to take a system that's serving 85% of people well and give it to the other 15%, but those 15% don't really have a lot of power. They're usually poor and they're just 15%. But if you take that 85% and you make their life worse, then all of a sudden it like the politics flips. And that might be one explanation.
Yeah, I think that has been the experience, and just more knowledge about the inner workings, the business of healthcare. I think it has provided a real big target for enterprising legislators who actually want to get something done.
I also think there's an ideological shift too. I know, I mean, you and I are both part of this transformation, but not to bring it back to Luigi, like who reads the American Prospect, right?
Prospect reader.
But there are
I'm
a lot of
putting that
people.
on the cover of the next magazine.
Yeah,
I
like
love it, Luigi Mangione.
yeah. No, but look, the financial crisis caused by too big to fail banks, right? All of a sudden, people look at the too big to fail and they're like, oh, that seems to apply to more than just banks. It takes a while for that to percolate through our country, but it really has. You see it with like a lot of people are afraid of big tech. You see, a lot of frustration with dominant firms across the board. And so I'm not surprised that it would be like the same language and arguments and
Yeah.
policy choices would be applying to like healthcare too.
And if you want to bring up your generational argument, there are people who are becoming lawmakers right now who lived through the financial crisis, whose formative political experiences were through the financial
Right. They lived through
crisis.
as children, right?
Yes.
Like it wasn't, it
Maybe
was
as
like,
children, or maybe a little bit older, or maybe
right.
as children they lived through, being lied to about the Iraq War. There's just been that, that's part of their life experience. And so maybe they're a little less trusting of this argument that, if we have economies of scale, we'll make everything cheaper in healthcare and everything will be better.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that is very cool to hear like what Hayden was saying about how these are the sort of seeds for a new healthcare system.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will be back next week with another episode. And just as a reminder, if you like what we're doing and you want to support Organized Money, you can go to organizedmoney.fm/subscribe. And you will also get emails about when you can just get the emails if you want. But you can give
We
us
get an
money.
email of every episode that we do. We send out emails, we send out transcripts, we send
Yeah.
out video. And also, we're trying to raise money to make this sustainable. Thank you to everyone who's done so far. It's really been great.
Oh, yes. I should thank you. Thank you so much. This actual podcast sounds really good. Rock Creek Productions, they're great. We pay them.
And we
They
pay
have
them.
to,
We
they, 'cause
pay them to
they need,
make it
they need
sound
to pay
great
rent and all the
and
rest
look
of
great.
things.
And support the show. And we will be back next week. Organized Money.
Organized money.